Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but Zoom transmissions depend on various things, and now we're set. We're delighted to see James Lee Burke with us. He's wrapped in a blanket because he's down. He's down in the basement.
That's it.
Which I told him was really cruel because it's 115 here, even if he's freezing in Montana. But so it goes. Anyway. Jim, I don't know that I've ever told you this, but we first met in 1992 when you were the Toastmaster at Left Coast Crime in San Francisco.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Long time back. And there was a dealer there in the book room that had loads of copies of Neon Rain and Heaven's Prisoners, which you had published Neon Rain after a significant absence from the publishing scene. I think it was something like 13 years.
Yeah, yes, I was 13 years. I was out of hardback print.
Well, I was so excited when I saw these two books that when the convention was over, I bought every single copy, which was a lot, and I shipped them back here to Scottsdale. And that really was because we'd only opened in 1989. It was really our first major signed book with a real star kind of a thing. And you really became such a star so soon. I think it was Black Cherry Blues, your third book, that really did that.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
And anyway, Jim has won 2 Edgars. He's a Grand Master for the Mystery Writers of America. And this book, Private Cathedral, is his 40th published book, which is terrific. And if you haven't seen it, which I've put in our own e-news, you can check on YouTube because there's a wonderful video of authors congratulating Jim on his 40th anniversary. So I'm going to turn this program over to Patrick Millikin of our staff, who's going to talk to Jim about a private cathedral. So Patrick, step up.
Thanks, Ms. Clark. I appreciate it. Pardon me. Oh.
Howdy, Jim. Great to see you.
Hi, Patrick. Yeah, I'm same here. How you been?
I'm doing all right. How's your guitar picking?
Well, I think it's been, I think, almost 60 years I've been playing, and I finally learned to pick the wildwood flower.
That's great. I think the last time I was talking to you, you had picked up a Fender Dobro, and we're kind of learning to pluck on that thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it weighs about 50 pounds.
Oh yeah, I have a cheapy metal bottle, kind of a national copy, and that thing weighs 50 pounds, but it's fun to play on. Yeah.
I think that was the original, wasn't it? The original Dobro.
The National.
Dobro.
Yeah, all those.
That's right.
All those blues guys in the 20s.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We digress, but it's so great to see you again. I was talking with Barbara, and actually the first time I met you was in 1994, and it was a year before I actually started working at the Poison Pen, and you were here for Dixie City Jam, and as I was telling Aaron, I was in awe of you then, and I'm in awe of you now. It's really been a pleasure to kind of be there for most of the Robicheaux series in real time, and watch just a remarkable career. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit, pick your brain a little bit about the new book, of course, which is
Yes.
just a beautiful, beautiful book, as always. And to kind of kick us off, can you, and also just so you know, I'm going to be looking down at my phone here, and I'm not being rude, I'm just monitoring the questions coming in on Facebook. Can you kind of kick off this discussion by talking a little bit about the metaphor of the private cathedral itself, which seems like a really a really beautiful metaphor.
Well, the narrator of the story is, of course, Dave Robicheaux, and he talks about what some people refer to as the long night of the soul. It's a meat grinder. And he finds himself on this journey into darkness. The long night of the soul is an experience that is you never want to have. It's a peculiar mix of what is called agitated depression and psychoneurotic anxiety, but it really will cook your toes. And the people who survive it, who come out on the other end of it, and they usually come out on the other end of it, earn a place called a private cathedral. The only downside is you're the only person in it. But nonetheless, there's mystical light coming through that stained glass. But the dues are heavy, brother.
I think there's some place in that same passage where you talk about the people who have these moments of metaphysical clarity are what I call members of the 3% club. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, that's it. It's a private club, and it's one that the entry fee is one I don't know that a person would like to do twice. But there's a certain freedom in having one's private cathedral. You never have to be afraid anymore. You don't fear. You don't discuss the problems of the world. It's hard to stay alive, stay concentrated on an average conversation. It's a private club. That's it. It's that simple. And people who have been through that experience all recognize one another immediately.
And so I thought that was a good place to sort of start talking about this book. And somewhere you mentioned it as kind of the third in a loose trilogy in your mind that sort of deals with, in some ways, the moment, the times that we're living in right now. Can you talk about kind of the theme of these three books and what that's all about?
Well, the three books are an allegory. The first three of the trilogy is titled Robicheaux. The second is the New Iberia Blues, and the third is, of course, the Private Cathedral. The story is about the coming of a figure who has been waiting in the wings for many years. And this is my perception, of course. The antagonist in these three books goes back to the 1830s with the incarnation of what's called nativism. It's been with us ever since. But there's been that person waiting to pick up a sword that's already dripping with blood. And he's not the enemy, though. It is those who support him, his constituents. All right, where does that eventually take us? We've had amateurs in the background. One of them was Huey Long, who was killed, by one of his bodyguards, accidentally shot. But he was the demagogue and demon from Louisiana. He was a master of dividing people among themselves, mendacity. Then we had Mr. Wallace, George Wallace, and Senator Joseph McCarthy. But they are an aggregate of the figure waiting in this trilogy, one who was far more calculating, far more successful, and a man who knows how to use what is worst in people for his own goals. And he's a cruel and bitter man. We meet him, and there's something demonic about him. But anyway, I'll leave it to the reader to decide whether or not this is a viable subject. But think of it this way, if a person does care to read this book. I think Dave Robicheaux is a successful narrator because he represents what's best in us. He has the virtues of the classical knight errant, but he is a blue-collar knight errant, and he's certainly a very American cavalier. But Dave Robicheaux in this book discovers that everything he believed in earlier about reality is probably untrue, because he encounters a time traveler from the year 1600. And the time traveler is an executioner and torturer who worked for the Inquisition. And his name is, my head went blank, Gillian Rossetti. And he is the most frightening figure I've ever written about. But anyway, he is trying, this man, the man who worked for the Inquisition, is trying to redeem his own soul. And he has a galleon, it's a prison galleon, loaded with poor souls like himself. So the story is highly allegorical. It has actually, the plot line is taken from the story of Tristan and Isolde, the famous early Scandinavian or Celtic legend about the two lovers who were torn apart by two feuding families. It's a classical story. But I think, it's not my opinion that counts, but everyone who has read it, I think, who's talked to me about it, who will still speak to me, says it's probably the best book in the Robicheaux series.
And
pardon me, I ate some spaghetti just before I sat down. I think Gideon Rossetti's got me around the throat.
Well, it's funny. I have a terrible tendency, Jim, to give away spoilers when I talk about a book, and so I don't want to do that tonight. But it's fairly early on in the book, and it's very haunting because Dave and his best friend Clete Purcell start having these same dreams about the same galleon, and it kind of and it kind of leads us. I don't want to spoil anything, but it's a very haunting, beautifully written book, as always.
Well, thank you.
And you mentioned the Tristan and Isolde story. In this case, Tristan is a musician named Johnny Shondell, right?
You got it. You bet. He's definitely an E major rock and roller.
It's funny because I wanted to ask you a little bit. I mean, music has played an enormous role in your work since the very first book.
Yeah.
And from the Lost Get Back Boogie, from Half of Paradise, you've been writing about musicians. I don't know if I really have a question there, but in this book, Johnny Shondell goes to Muscle Shoals, very famous, iconic place. Can you talk a little bit about those two families and how they work in the book, the Shondells and the, the Belanger? How do you pronounce their last name?
Belanger.
Yeah.
There are two families here at feuding for the control of the vice in Louisiana. One are the Shondells, and the other family is located in New Orleans, and that's the Belanger family. But their hatred of each other goes all the way back to the Florentine feuds during the 16th and 17th century. And so the feud is continued, and Isolde, this beautiful young girl born in New Orleans from the Belanger family, is delivered unto the Shondells. And she's delivered to a man called Uncle Mark Shondell, who is the quintessential force that this man makes ordinary evil look very pale by comparison. But I'm laughing at this. It's really not funny. What this man represents is, again, a figure in whom people wish to entrust their souls and entrust their country. And he has enormous control over them. So others, again, would have to make their own judgment about the authority of the voice that governs the three stories. I don't feel there's anything I've written in any three books of the trilogy that I cannot defend. Historically, all of the events in this book, historically, have occurred. And Dave Robicheaux, more specifically, sets out to try to discover the origins of human cruelty. And he has been to war, he's been to executions in Angola prison. He, like most police officers and crime reporters, newspaper reporters, have seen things in their lives that they will never discuss with anyone. Anyone out there, police officer or a medic or a newspaper man or woman, knows I'm telling the truth when I say you have seen things you wish you could scrub out of your dreams. And these things will never go in a newspaper, and few people who have witnessed them will ever speak of them unless they're drunk. And that is the truth. It's a fact. And there are things about human behavior we witness and we hope somehow it was simply a nightmare in the middle of the day. Unfortunately, it was not.
Right. Now, Jim, from going back quite a ways, I think one of the first books of yours that I read was In the Electric Mist with Confederate Dead. And it's such a magical book. From the very beginning, you have you portray time, and history as not exactly a linear sequence of events. And that's sort of a depiction that has come full circle now. And you talk about that quite a bit in the new book. And New Orleans, there are certain places, and New Orleans is certainly one of them, where the past and the present all seems to be kind of mixed up together. Any comment about that, or am I on the right track?
Well, yes, sir. You're right. You're absolutely right in the center of it. The perception that Dave Robicheaux has about time is that it's illusionary. Calendars and clocks are the invention of man. But Dave Robicheaux believes that perhaps their time is not sequential. And this is a belief my father had. My father was something of a historian. And he believed that time, or existence, past, present, and future all occur at the same time. He used to say, as though in a dream in the mind of God. And he said something along the same lines about art and science. He used to say art and science consist of the incremental discovery of what already exists. But in other words, we talk about eternity and stepping into eternity. We're already inside it. And even the early Greek atomist would agree with that. That the atom, once created, is eternal. But what is its inception? Well, we don't know. But Dave Robicheaux finally concludes, or comes to at least believe, in his own way, that the great drama is all around us if we would just see it. All we have to do is to stick our hand in the veil, put our hand through the veil. It's right there on the other end of our fingers. And that's what I believe. And that's why I believe that the departed are always with us, and the unborn child is always with us. And that's why we owe a legacy and an enormous debt to both the dead and those who are not born. We do not have a right to take from those who have not had chance to walk upon the earth. And that's what my dad used to do. He's an extraordinary man. He's one of the most intelligent people I ever met. But in the story, in The Electric Mist of the Confederate Dead, we meet General John Hood. Excuse me. Well, the story is really not, or the allusion, the character, is not a representative from the war between the states. He's actually the Arthurian figure from the great work by Thomas Malory. The legend of Arthur, if you remember, was that when England needed him again, he would return. And the sword would be taken from the lake and put in his hand, and he would once again liberate his people. Well, when I wrote this book, I believe I used General Hood, and he was a very brave man, but he didn't have, of course, the cultural stature of King Arthur from Wales, and excuse me. But anyway, yes, the book is about, it's Homeric in nature. It starts just before 9/11. Dave Robicheaux is looking out upon the Gulf of Mexico. It's late at night. The moon's high above the waves, and the waves are the color of burgundy. And he knows that somehow he can reach out and touch the invasion of Troy. Well, that sounds like a kind of maniacal way to think, but he's in effect stepping into a story that is 3,000 years old. And that's what the trilogy is about.
You mentioned your father, and actually one of the things I wanted to ask you was just kind of about your life and how I know you've had you had a struggle as a young writer. You had 3 books published when you were a fairly young man, right? In your early 30s, something like that, and then
no, I was 12.
You were 12 years old?
No,
Actually, 23.
I was much younger. I finished my first book when I was 23.
Wow. Wow.
After Paradise. I wrote it on a pipeline.
You and Carson McCullers, same age.
I'm so old, I can't. I'll give old age a bad reputation.
But I know that you did an awful lot of interesting work. You know, you were, as I understand it, a social worker. You were worked on an oil rig. Is that correct? Can you talk about some of those jobs?
Well, excuse me.
And how they informed your work.
Well, I worked a little bit in the oil field here and there, and I had a number of jobs over the years, and I was also I taught several universities. But my wife and I did travel with the children years from one coast to the other, and we worked lots of jobs and difficult jobs at that. But anyway, we learned a great deal through that experience, and my family was always supportive of me, and I owe them an enormous debt. The things I learned in my brief time working on pipelines or in the oil field were a sense of humility, because the men who worked on those jobs were the bravest I ever knew, and they were the generation that grew up in the 1930s, and they went to the war in World War II. And they were a remarkable generation of people. They never complained, and the job was very hard, often quite dangerous. You could get killed in the oil field in a blink. But they never complained, and the pay was low. There were no unions in the oil field back then. And the interesting thing about these men is that none of them had back second names. They were often uneducated. and had actually no first names. They had initials, WJ, JW, LT. They had known each other for years and never knew one another's last names, but they were fine people. I always thought they were the bravest people I've ever known. Just absolutely fearless. I remember I was on board it was a shooting rig, a seismograph rig, and we had a lot of canned dynamite on it with primers and caps. And this was during Hurricane in 1957. And wow, lightning was exploding all around us. And I've never been so scared. And not one of these fellows blinked. And if they were scared, they showed no sign of it. I've always remembered their faces after all these years, because it sounded just like, I've never heard burst of thunder so loud. Lightning was hitting all around us with 160 pounds of canned dynamite on a steel deck.
Well, there's so many questions I'd like to ask you, and I don't want to hog up the whole time, but I can't not ask you about how you developed your singular prose style. There's nobody that writes, about nature the way you do. And tell me a little bit about some of your early teachers and mentors that kind of shaped you. And also, if you wouldn't mind, I heard you say some 25 years ago that Gerard Manley Hopkins was a major influence on you in terms of his, the metaphysical image. I heard you speak very eloquently about that.
Well, I had many influences on me, and I started writing. I wrote my first short story and published it in a college magazine when I was only 19 years old. My first cousin was Andre Dubus, and we were only 4 months apart, and we were each other's pacing horse. I tried to write a short story for the Saturday Evening Post when I was in the 5th grade with my cousin Len Heaslip. But anyway, I discovered the work of Ernest Hemingway, and he had a great influence on me, but so did John Steinbeck. But the ones who were most influential were James T. Farrell, John Dos Passos, and certainly, the famous Jesuit poet. My head went blank again.
Hopkins.
Pardon?
Hopkins.
Sure. Yeah, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And his use of the metaphysical image, as it's called, he resurrected the interest in the work of John Donne and George Herbert and, of course, Andrew Marvell. And those men actually influenced the prose of Scott Fitzgerald. If you look at the imagery in The Great Gatsby, you see echoes and reflections from the work of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Anyway, the point is that I learned, as most writers do, to be an eclectic reader and never to read bad writing. It's like reading bad tennis. It messes your game up. It's the real point. Don't touch it at gunpoint. But I was influenced by many writers, but on a personal level, it was golly Moses, you gotta excuse that, the Big Sky. I'm not big, well, A.B. Guthrie certainly influenced me to some degree. But John Neihart, who wrote Black Elk Speaks, he was my poetry teacher at the University of Missouri. He was a grand showman, and he believed in my work and gave me great encouragement. Actually, the person who influenced me most educationally was a lady she was a professor at Southwestern Louisiana University, and her name was Professor Lyle Williams. And I was in her freshman English class, and I've been a very poor student in high school, and I majored in homeroom and study hall. But anyway, each week she would grade my weekly essay and return it to me as everybody else in the class, and it would be covered with red ink. And the highest grade I ever got on my essays was a D minus. D as in dumb. And at about midterm, I thought I better do something. So I went to see Ms. Williams, and I said, I don't understand why I'm getting a D minus every year, and you can't imagine the red ink on the pages. It looked like a disemboweled cow. And she was very Victorian, and she had this lovely plantation English accent. And she said, well, Mr. Burke, she put on her glasses, these Prince-Ney glasses. Mr. Burke, to be honest, you can answer your question fairly. Why do you get a D minus? Well, your prose, let's see. Your handwriting makes me wish the Phoenicians had not invented the alphabet. In fact, they are an assault on my eyeballs. But son, you write with such passion, I couldn't give you an F. Anyway, she said that if I would come in each Saturday morning and rewrite my essay, each week till the end of the semester, she'd take another look at my grade. And that's what I did. And I got a B as in bravo, and I made the dean's list. That's right. I graduated in the last quarter of my high school class, but because of Ms. Williams, I graduated with honors at the University of Missouri.
Wow.
That's a fact. She changed my life.
What a great story. And then you went on yourself, I know, for many years to teach writing and to teach English. And this is kind of a question just for me, but can you talk a little bit about Charles Williford? I know you knew him, and I just love his work, and I think his work is neglected.
Yeah, I was friends with Charles Williford for 20 years. We taught together in Miami, and he was such a fine fellow, and he never took himself seriously. He had a great sense of humor, and I met Ernest Hemingway's brother, through Charles, and they were both just great gentlemen. They had lived extraordinary lives. And Charles would never write about the war. He was a professional soldier. He joined the old army. Actually, he joined the Horse Cavalry in 1936 when he was 16 years old. But he was at Arnhem, and he took his tank through German lines and put 23 grunts on top of it and took them home. He got the Silver Star and the Croix de Guerre, but he would never talk about it, never write one word about it. He wrote an autobiographical book called Something About a Soldier, and it deals with his years at Schofield Barracks, same place James Jones was. But he did not write about the war. And I used to try, one day I said, why don't you do that, Charles? And he said, oh, Hemingway, and who else did he say? Hemingway and someone else have written all about that. Who cares?
That memoir he did about his childhood, riding the rods and during the Great Depression, I Was Looking for a Street. I think that's kind of a masterpiece.
It's a masterpiece, and fortunately, he asked me to blurb it, and I blurbed it in time for him to see the blurb before he passed away. And I had great admiration for Charles, but it was he who gave me encouragement in the writing of the Neon Rain. and I had written 2 chapters, and I sent them to him. And he wrote me back, and he said, Jim, you may have created one of the most popular voices in American crime writing. He meant Dave Robicheaux. Yeah.
That's
that was
interesting.
Charles.
That's interesting, Jim, because I wasn't aware of that influence on Dave Robicheaux. Because there was I think the Neon Rain was 1987 or so, and then your previous.
That's it.
And then the Lost Get Back Boogie was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years before that. Was there elements of Robicheaux in the Lost Get Back Boogie?
I think so, but it was only 2 years. Well, okay, this is what occurred. I wrote my first novel when I was 20. I was 22 and 23 years old, but I finished it when I was 23. And it received a 6-column banner headline review in the New York Times. That's right. Then I published a book about the coal mine wars in Kentucky called To the Bright and Shining Sun. It had a very good reception. And then I wrote Lay Down My Sword and Shield, the first Holland book, all within a short space. Then I wrote The Lost Get Back Boogie, and I think I finished it, I'd say 1972. And I thought I was on board, and I went 13 years. I couldn't sell anything in hardback. And so I wrote, I wrote other novels that had never been published. The Lost Get Back Boogie was rejected by 111 editors. Anyway, I was fishing up here in Montana with Rick DeMarinis, my writer friend, and he said, Jim, you've written every other kind of book. Why don't you try to write a crime novel? He said, all you got to do is write 2 chapters, and you can get an advance. And that's how I started. I started writing it in longhand in San Francisco, 2 blocks away from the famous bookstore, Ferlinghetti's
City Lights
bookstore there, City Lights bookstore. And I wrote the first 2 chapters, and those chapters I sent to Charles. But you're right, the voice of Ari Perret, a musician and a Korean War veteran, is a voice not unlike Dave Robicheaux's. I never actually changed my work. The Robicheaux novel is only different because I used a sometimes police officer as the narrator, but the work has never changed. The themes have never changed. The characters, the backdrop are all the same since that first book that I finished in the fall of 1960 to the present.
And then, of course, the Holland family looms large in your life. 2 for Texas was the paperback original historical novel that came out in the early 80s. And of course, you went on to write, a number of books about the Holland family. Was that family loosely based on your own, on the Burke clan?
Well, my mother's family. My grandmother was a Holland. Her name was Alifair Holland. And her father was Sam Morgan Holland, who was the patriarch of the family. And I used him in the story, the books. He was well known in Texas. He was in the Civil War. And he was also a drover. He drove his own cows, 2,000 head at a time, up the Chisholm Trail. But he was also a gunman. And he killed 9 men in gun duels, and to his shame, and then eventually became a Baptist saddle preacher. He had quite a life.
Wow, yeah, that is quite a life. Quite a variety of occupations.
Yeah.
Let me see what kind of questions we might have for you from our audience here.
Okay.
Let's see here. Got a lot of people watching. Yeah, I have a viewer just says, agrees with us that Williford's Hoke Moseley novels are great American literature and not to be missed. Amen. Let's see here. Okay. When was it that you first made your way to Montana? I know you've been based there for a long time now. Was that back in the 60s or?
Oh, yes, 1966. We moved out here, and I taught 3 years at the university, and Pearl was like my wife was a librarian. Great place to live, not a good place to make a living, at least for us. And we found ourselves without tenure, and that's the golden grail in the academic world. And so I taught at several other places. Eventually, with the commercial success of the novel Black Cherry Blues, we were able to move up to Montana, and we bought a home this very simple home way up a canyon, and then we did right well here, and then lived for many years, half the year in Louisiana, in New Iberia. It's my family's home. And we've had a very good life here in Montana and, of course, on the Gulf Coast.
Right. So you were able to give up that hellhole of Wichita where you were teaching for a while, right?
Oh, no, it wasn't a hellhole. Who told you that? Jeez. Well, the people of Kansas, best people on earth.
Well, I heard you say a particular story about a telephone burial plot salesman. Do you remember that story?
Oh, golly, yeah, but I shouldn't have said that. Oh, this fellow, he was selling cemetery plots, and he called up and he used the church to get figuratively his foot in the doorway. I thought it was pretty, not well. I mean, to use religion, the guy was selling great lots, and my heavens. And I didn't know really what to say. And then I said, listen, have you ever been in Kansas in the heart of winter when it's 20 below and the wind is blowing 40 knots and the sky is black with dust and it looks like the sun sank over the edge of the planet for the last time? Can you imagine spending the rest of eternity here? And Pearl was waving her hands in the background and stop it. And this fellow said, I take it you're not from Kansas. But a friend of mine who was writer in residence at Wichita State University, where I had a great experience. I loved my job there at the university. But my friend was interviewed by the Eagle Beacon newspaper there in Wichita, and they asked him what he thought of Kansas people, and he looked really bemused, and then he said, Kansans are the best people I've ever met. I just don't know why they live in Kansas. Oh, it's the weather.
Yeah, I shouldn't have brought that up.
Go ahead.
I shouldn't have brought that up, Jim. I just heard you talk about it. So, no offense to Wichita, Kansas.
And I didn't mean you said that I write my first books in my 30s, and I laughed, but I didn't. I apologize for that laugh. What I meant was, I started writing so early that it became almost a vice with me. I never wanted to be anything else. That was it when I was a kid. I wrote all the time, all kinds of things, and I was never able to stop. I just could not. It was like an obsession. And it's a peculiarity about age and art that I'm old enough now to look back, and when I read my early work, I might see changes in the way I would write certain things. I would maybe show a little more wisdom in my work today than I did back then. I would have that realization. But what I think that I can feel very grateful for, because I did not do anything to deserve this gift. Even when I was very young, I felt that a sense of, it's a vanity, I guess, that I knew a truth that other people did not. And I never tried to explain it to them. But I always believed that I saw some kind of votive candle out there in the rains. But I knew things that were going to happen in the same way that a prophet might. I knew they were going to happen. I could hear people's thoughts. And I also learned early on, particularly when I started trying to write seriously, that the great prose, and this becomes imperative with the writing of dialogue, comes from the mouths of simple and uneducated people. And I remember the words of Wordsworth. He said something on that way. People of humble origins can be our teachers very often. And of course, it's a romantic way to think. But I was working on a pipeline in Houston, Texas, and I used to ride to work on the bus early in the morning, and that was at a time when buses were segregated, and people of color were forced to sit in the back of the bus. And I was sitting right in front of two black women, and they were talking to one another. And one said, "You know, it was so cold last night." And the other lady said, it surely do get cold when that sun goes down." And I thought, it's an iambic line. That's it. Every other syllable, every other syllable was accent, just like a sonnet. She was speaking in couplets, not a woman who probably at best went to the 5th grade. But that's it. And I always knew from that day to this one, you don't learn dialogue by writing it. You learn dialogue by listening to it. A good writer is a good listener. That's it. That's the key.
There's, you mentioned your kind of mentor, John Neihardt. There's a lot of kind of that, especially in Black Elk Speaks, but also in his Cycle of the West. There's a lot of that kind of dreamlike, visionary quality to it, which definitely features into your work. And I know you've talked a lot about the importance of dreams and visions and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got that from John Neihardt. And he wrote a famous book called, oh Lord, that's it, the
Black Elk Speaks.
Golly. Well, Black Elk Speaks is his most well known, but Cycle of the West.
Cycle of the West.
He worked on 18 years, and he worked on it only at night. And I asked him once, why did he do that? And he said, "Jim, it's only at night that dead poets speak to you." And that's what he was a mystic himself, and he was an extraordinary person. When he was my poetry instructor, that's what our class was called, poetry, or creative writing with an emphasis on poetry. He told us many stories about his early life. He knew everybody. Williford, for example. He was one of the village poets in 1905 with Max Bodenheim. He knew the greatest writers of the early 20th century, and he was anyway. The point I'm making is that he was a mystic, the real thing. In his front yard, he lived on a wheat farm outside of Columbia, Missouri. He had what he called the tree of life. And I think it was a willow right in the middle of a circle that was then covered with flowers. And in the center was a black road, and then it was crossed by a red road. And in the center was the tree of life. And that was the artifice that Black Elk used when he called upon the four corners of the universe to help his people. And of course, they were ultimately destroyed. But John Neihardt was a friend of Buffalo Bill Cody. He had a Peacemaker revolver that Cody gave him, and I held it in my hand. That's a fact. But to have a teacher like that, and many people all respected John Neihardt, but they didn't know the type that he was. Another one is A.B. Guthrie. That is one of the most ignored great writers in all of American literature. I have never figured it out. The Way West and the Big Sky were the equal of the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's not hyperbole, it's the truth. Some of the best prose ever written came from the hand of A.B. Guthrie. And he was also an early supporter of my work. But man, was he a talent.
Wow. You mentioned Rick DeMarinis. Recently lost him. What another great underappreciated writer.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Rick was probably the most versatile writer of American literature in the 20th century. He'd write one book so different from another one of his books, no one would ever put the two together. And he could write anything. He could write on any level.
I've been dominating this conversation, so I apologize, everybody. Let me get to some of these questions. But it's so much fun to talk to you, Jim, and I appreciate you spending the time with us today. Jennifer,
well, thank you.
Jennifer has a question. She says, how hard is it to pick a title for your books? And do you have any kind of hand in the cover design?
Well, I've been fortunate, and number one with the covers, because I've had great artists who worked on them. And the lady at Simon & Schuster, Miss Jackie, she's a really fine person, but she's a great artist as well. I mean, her jackets are separate artworks. The only title that I did not put on my book is Two for Texas, and I couldn't come up with one. And a friend of mine just said, how about Two for Texas? And I said, well, okay, and I just put it on there. And I don't think it's too good of a title. But the other titles, more serious issues, your question is a very valid one. The title is always in the book. Somewhere along the way, I'll find it in the book.
So you don't necessarily start with the title. It presents itself in the text.
That's correct.
Yeah, I remember the Stained White Radiance, one of my favorite titles of yours. Was that Shelley?
That's right.
Do you have a favorite of your own titles?
Oh, Lordy, no, I don't.
Sorry about that. Let's see. If someone wanted to become a writer, do you have any kind of standard advice you would like to give, or you usually give to aspiring writers?
Never quit. You never quit.
All right. Okay, a quick question about, we have and I'm kind of paraphrasing people, sorry about that, but someone is pointing out your book, The Tin Roof Blowdown, and what an amazing book that was about Katrina, very personal. Did you feel compelled to write about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's probably the greatest crime committed in this country, outside of 9/11. happened there was a it's disgusting what occurred there. He was allowed.
Sure. I have a customer named Dave who's asking, would you comment on your work in progress? You made some hints about it in a previous interview.
Oh, I just actually finished the book. So in other words, it's just on my editor's desk. So maybe it's in progress. Okay. It's titled "The Pillars of Heaven," and it's a story about migrant farm workers. And it's set in Trinidad, Colorado, in 1962.
Wow. Trinidad, Raton Pass area.
Yes, sir. That's where it takes place. It's a very unusual book.
Let's see what else we have here, and then we'll take it in for a landing. I just have an awful lot of people that don't necessarily have questions, but are just saying how much they love you and love your work. And
well, I appreciate that very much.
yeah. Let's see here. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. I have a question about the film adaptations of your work thus far, which is kind of the inevitable question. Anything going on in the works? Any film or TV adaptations currently?
Well, yeah. Excuse me. I wasn't sure the question. Were you asking about?
I was just asking whether there were any future Robicheaux or TV or film projects.
Things under contract, and one's in production. I'm not supposed to say a lot.
I understand. No problem.
Well, no, I can't. I don't have a gag order on me. The people who are making the film would be the ones to talk with, and I've got one that's in production. I've got one. One of my books is in production, and the COVID shut it down 7 days before completion of filming. So I'm hoping that there'll be a time when again we can continue filming. But I've always I love motion pictures. I think anyone who doesn't love motion pictures has a spiritual disorder. But I've been very fortunate, and I worked with some very famous people, and I've always had a grand time. I had a correspondence with Burt Reynolds, and he said,
Oh, really?
"Why up when you can make movies?"
Yeah, really. Well, I have a special viewer here who goes by the name of Alifair Burke, who's watching, and she just says, "Hi, Dad," and she says hi to me. Hey, Alifair, it's great. She's a terrific writer in her own right. Yeah, I can't wait to see her new book.
She was reading Cool Hand Luke when she was 5 years old, and when she was in first grade, she wrote her first short stories. That's it. And she graduated at the top of Stanford Law. How about this? I'm not making this story up. When I tell people that, there's a pause, and the person says, "Your wife must be so smart." I'm not kidding you. That's why I say I never had to seek humility. It always found me.
You married? Well, you did marry well, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, Pearl and I have been married over 60 years.
Wow. Well, Jim, hey, it's been a real treat and a privilege to talk to you, and yeah, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Sorry I didn't get to more of the questions, but this always happens. And hope to see you again at some point down the future when all this craziness stabilizes a little bit.
Can I say something before we get off?
I'm
not wearing a hat because I'm bald, It's because I have too much hair and it's cold. So I apologize for wearing a hat in the room.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks again, and you have a wonderful rest of the evening. And congratulations.
Thank you, Beth.
Yeah, congratulations on the publication of A Private Cathedral.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right. We'll catch you later.